Hello YouTube, it's the Drunken Kobold here, today with the review of the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e. What does the Game Mastery Guide offer? To start, the Game Mastery Guide is a book for the Game Master. So while there are option and variant rules in this book in terms of character creation, they aren't on the table for the players unless the GM specifically allows it, whereas variant rules in the core rulebook are assumed to be allowed unless the GM states otherwise. The introduction to the Game Mastery Guide explains the role of the GM, a section on how to use this book, and a section explaining when you might want to start using some of these tools, whether you are a new GM fresh behind the screen, or you're a veteran GM who's been playing so long, you've lost count of the cancelled sessions. It's important to note that while the Game Mastery Guide is considered one of the central books of Pathfinder 2e, in addition to the core rulebook, bestiary, and advanced player's guide, that these tools are optional tools and that the GM can use as many or as few of them as they want. This book is simply to build on the basics. Chapter 1 is the basics of game mastery and is the reason every GM should pick up this book in addition to the core rulebook. In this section, you will find helpful tips for running encounters, running the game as the party explores the map, rules for downtime, conflict resolution, structuring campaigns, building adventures and encounters from scratch, and more. A lot of this feels like the Dungeon Master's Guide from 5e, but having sections on educating rules and conflict resolution were topics that I feel they should have included in the DMG, and I feel they're not even elaborated on enough here, but having it is better than not having it at all. The next thing, I want to give a shout out to Pathfinder 2e for including the Session 0 in the Game Mastery Guide. It took D&D 6 years to finally dedicate a section of a book to Session 0, and while it feels more like the Game Mastery Guide could have went into more detail about the purpose of Session 0 and how to conduct one, I want to give Pathfinder props for at least having it now to build on later rather than not including it at all. There will be a day that Session 0 is in the core rulebook of a game, but it is not this day. As this is a chapter on the basics, I have to say this chapter is really well written, and while not as in-depth as it could have been, was still a great way to introduce new game masters without bogging them down with tons of information and tables. Chapter 2 of the book is Game Master Tools. This is a section of the book that leans more to the experienced game master or the bold one who wants to dive right in. Since a lot of the tools in the Dungeon Master's Guide from 5e are incorporated right into the core rulebook of Pathfinder 2e, it's easy to feel that this, compared to 5e, is lacking. But when you consider the game mastery sections of the core rulebook in this book, I do not feel this section feels short on content. In this section, you will find rules for creating your own creatures, your own magic items, guidance for sentient and cursed items, treasure, and world building, among other tools. This section is great for GMs who have the time to commit to creating campaigns from scratch, but if you're a busy person, or you're like me and feels like Paizo already does great content, campaigns and bestiaries, why would I want to create my own? This section might feel a little redundant. Though, the sections on sentient and cursed items and the section on planes is a worthwhile read for any GM. I do not discredit this section's content or the effort that went into it at all, and I can see why this may be someone's favorite chapter, especially if they've mastered the basics and want to delve deeper, but it's just not for me. Chapter 3 is the subsystem rules. These are the rules within the rules and apply to things like researching within the game, chases, espionage, dueling, and vehicles. While a couple of these made it into the core rules of 5e, incorporating any of these into the core rulebook would have made it more cumbersome than it already is, and I have to say I'm glad that all of these made it into a separate book instead. I do wish that vehicles had more for naval and aerial vehicles and more to do with combat than it does, especially since it's already been done in Pathfinder and Starfinder, but the fact that this section is as expansive as it is already quite impressive. Other highlights from here include the rules for chases, as well as playing out research and infiltration. Some of the downsides, as well, this chapter has a lot of great subsystems. I feel there are subsystem rules for downtime, such as starting and operating businesses, that players would love, and the framework for these subsystems already do exist for players willing to buy books from other editions and games. They could have just been included in here, and that would have made it feel so much better. As such, this chapter, as much as it's probably my favorite chapter for including cool stuff into your games, feels lacking. and even with the content in this book, it feels like only scratching the surface of its potential. I would have preferred to see a more expanded on chapter than a mere 33 pages. Chapter 4 is the Variant Rules section, and this is tied for second place with Game Master Basics as best chapter in the book. This chapter has rules and variants for ability scores, alignment, crafting backgrounds, level 0 characters, stamina, and more. I want to start with ability scores because this is my favorite section of the chapter. First, it gives a new system to ability boosts and for 5e players ASIs. I really like the idea of characters getting smaller ability boosts more often, as it makes the change in a character feel less drastic and more organic, while giving guidance on how to implement this change so it wouldn't be abused by players. Second, it introduces a long-loved system back to Pathfinder 2e and updates it for the modern game, Point Buy. While Point Buy does look the same for the most part as it does in the past and in other editions, there are a couple key differences here, like having set base stats and gaining more points to spend at higher levels. Lastly is the alternative score system, which does away with constitution scores, adds a new score in the form of agility, and offers minor changes to wisdom and charisma saves. I feel like this system is based slightly off the Expanse, which has 9 scores instead of the usual 6. The Expanse opts to keep constitution and makes perception a base score rather than a sub-score and skill of wisdom. To be honest, if Pathfinder ever does make a 3e, I would like to see the ability score system of the Expanse and add honor and sanity from 5e, but that is a subject for another video. Next is the changes to the alignment system. While none of these are drastic changes, I feel players coming from 5e would much rather enjoy these rule variants as they get used to Pathfinder 2e, rather than making them jump from a system where alignment really doesn't matter to one where alignment really matters a lot. Intentions is a no alignment system new to Pathfinder, and I quite really enjoy it. And I'm actually considering using it to replace alignment in D&D 5e. You know you're doing something right when part of your game is better in both your game and your competition's game than their way of doing things. The icing on the cake would be if 5e created an alignment system for players moving from 2e to 5e, in that made alignments matter. The last section I want to talk about is deep backgrounds. In Xanathar's Guide to Everything, the player options sections of the book gave guidance for expanding on your player's background and creating backstory. This, in combination with the book, The Ultimate RPG Character Backstory Guide, has been my go-to for helping players create really well fleshed out, realistic to their level backstories. After all, why does your level 1 character have in their backstory that they slayed a dragon? Maybe a dragonfly. Well, the Game Mastery Guide is giving me a new arsenal of tools I can choose from for crafting my own backgrounds in 2e and beyond, and I couldn't be more excited to share these options with my players, regardless of the game or edition we're playing. The last chapter is the NPC section of the Game Mastery Guide. This is probably my least favorite chapter. For context, D&D 5e split this chapter in its core rulebooks between the Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual. By adding the content from the PHB to the Monster Manual, the Monster Manual would have been more comparable to the Bestiary 1. As such, while Bestiaries are for the GM and this is a GM book, I feel like having an NPC section of Bestiary 1 would have made more sense than an NPC section of a book that otherwise has nothing to do with stats for encounters. This is just nitpicking, to be honest, and while to me they feel out of place, the fact these NPCs exist with such a large variety is really cool, and they live up to the standard that 2e has set for itself. So, with all that said about the book from a mechanical standpoint, how does the book stand up aesthetics-wise? 2e so far has a reputation of being one of the cleanest RPG systems to date, in that it is simple, it's easy to read and understand, and it's well organized. Well, Game Mastery Guide does not disappoint and continues this trend of delivering clean, organized content. While this book to me feels lacking in the art department compared to the other books, it is worth noting that this book is significantly smaller, so less art is to be expected. That said, the art of this book is still visually appealing, and very well done with great use of techniques. Between well-written game mechanics and a great visual appeal, Pathfinder 2e is a strong contender for being able to replace D&D 5e as the world's greatest role-playing game. And if Paizo keeps delivering content like this, they will have earned themselves a loyal player and game master. All in all, I have to give the Game Mastery Guide an 8 out of 10, with the only changes that I would have preferred was a little bit more in-depth detail for the subsystems chapter, and the NPCs being part of the bestiary. Oh, and for the love of all that is lawful good, make Session 0 part of the core rules in the future. Well, with all that said, do you agree with my assessment or do you disagree? Is there something that you feel I missed? Let me know in the comments below, and if you feel I deserve it, please leave a like and consider subscribing. That's all for today. Cheers, and may the rolls be with you.